Good morning and welcome to the London Assembly Economy Committee meeting, both to people who are watching on YouTube and people who are watching on the London Assembly webcast itself. I'd like to welcome members of the committee, our invited guests and those members of the public who might be watching to today's meeting of the Economy Committee. In accordance with government regulations, we are holding this meeting on a virtual basis with all of the committee members and guests participating remotely, including myself, the chair, which is the first time I've chaired the meeting remotely. And technologically speaking, this morning has not got off to a good start. So if I'm disconnected from the meeting, my trusty deputy chair will take over the chairing. Well, let's hope that doesn't happen, and that the focus of today's meeting is only on the changing nature of work after COVID-19, which is our main item of business today. And we encourage everybody who wants to get involved in the discussion themselves on social media to use the hashtag Assembly Economy. Before we move on to that item, we have got a few items of formal business to go through first. And I wondered if I could ask our clerk, Lauren, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and whether we've received any apologies for absence. Lauren, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chair. The following members are currently present on this call. Yourself, the Chair, Assembly Member Cooper, the Deputy Chairman, Assembly Member Bailey, Assembly Member Hall, Assembly Member Qureshi, and Assembly Member Russell. We've received apologies from Assembly Member Desai, for whom Assembly Member Shah is attending as a substitute.
Okay, that's great. So item 2 on the agenda is traditionally the declaration of interests, which is to be found at pages 1 to 4 in the agenda. Could I ask members to note the list of appointments as they're set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Is that noted?
Noted.
Thank you. Has anyone got any other interests to declare? I shall take silence to be no. Okay, there are no further declarations. The minutes of our last meeting, which was held on the 4th of November, is to be found on pages 5 to 38 of the agenda pack. And could we confirm, please, can we agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of November as a true record? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. The summary list of actions is to be found on pages 39 to 48 of our agenda pack. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings? And there is some additional correspondence which is attached, which has been sent and also received. Can we note that?
Noted.
Thank you. So that brings us on to the main item of our agenda today, which is the changing nature of work after COVID-19. And here we all are proving, I think it would be fair to say, that the nature of work has changed, because normally we would all previously have been in the chamber, and today literally none of us are, unless there is someone in the, well, I suppose Bow Tie might be in the chamber helping with the technological support, but that's not technically the members of the committee. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our guests who have kindly tuned in to join us virtually this morning. I'll start with Jules Pike, who is the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. And I think we're probably going to be talking mostly with Jules this morning about the skills part of his brief. You're very welcome, Jules. We also have been joined this morning by Patrick Dubec, who is the Head of Regeneration at the GLA, by Michelle Pettini, who is the Senior Economist at the GLA, Jordan Cummings, who joins us from the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, where he is the Senior Associate Director and Head of London Policy. You're very welcome, Jordan, this morning. We also have Rowena Howie with us this morning, who is the London Policy Chair from the FSB, the Federation of Small Businesses. And Rowena, we do understand that you won't be able to stay with us should the meeting continue past 11:30, which I suspect it will because there's a lot to discuss today. We also have Laura Davison, who is from the City of London Corporation, where she is the Director of Intelligence and Research. And last, but very much not least, and I think we're going to be having some questions about the situation with buildings in London. We've got Michael Cracknell, who is the Director from Deloitte Real Estate. You're very welcome, Michael, and thank you very much for being with us this morning. And from 11:30, we will joined by Sam Gurney, who is the London Regional Secretary from the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to check my WhatsApp, so if you need to send me a message, Assembly members, to say that you've heard something from one of our guests and you feel inspired to add an additional question, but part of the technological breakdown has been a power cut, so I'm slightly low on power on all my devices. I have no idea what's been going on in my house. Without further ado, we're going to move on to the first set of questions, which sadly for those of you who would rather not hear any more from me are going to be coming from me, and then we will move on to lots of the other Assembly members who are going to be asking many other questions as well. My first question is really one that I'm going to direct to all of our guests, which is to get you all in the mood, I suppose, but also to get your thoughts. And I'll start with you, if I may, Jules, and that is what, in your view, have been the key impacts of the pandemic on the use of commercial, retail and office space? And then after that, I'll probably come to Michael Cracknell for you, and then anyone else who wants to add something. So, Jules, if we could start with you.
Thanks, Chair. Obviously, there has been a huge and immediate impact in the way that we all operate our lives, and you found that this morning working from home. And I think that's a very perhaps timely and apposite happening that demonstrates that the future working from home, it's all going to be easy, and this is the future, is perhaps somewhat questionable. And I've said that to you, I think, before in this committee. I think the impacts are varied, both in the impacts they're having immediately now on the ground, and I think they're even more varied as to the impacts that they will have on each different area in the future. I think a lot of that's driven by the fact that we were seeing dramatic changes in retail anyway. It would have happened over a longer time. But what we've seen happen over the last 6 to 9 months has compressed what we almost certainly would have seen over the next 5 years with regard to retail. I think offices and that area of commercial, very different situation. Yes, there's been a dramatic change in usage. Yes, we have seen a downturn in lettings in offices, but that's the immediate usage, related to the immediate usage. The activity elsewhere within the commercial office sector tells a different story. It tells one of a relatively optimistic market in terms of office space needed, and the discussion now is about what type, not whether to build offices. It's about the kind of use that we'll be making of it. So more shared space, more collaboration space, less just rows and rows of desks, but where there is desk space, more space, because there's been a huge contraction in recent years about the amount of desk space per worker, per office staff member, and perhaps this is reversing that. And obviously the straight retail, we've as I say, I've rehearsed that, but obviously the current usage of offices is having an impact on that. But that will come back when we're beginning to use offices more in central London.
Thank you. I think that was a really useful beginning. I'm going to come to Michael Cracknell next, as I said, and I wondered if there are things that you'd like to add to Jules's initial comments on the impacts of the pandemic on the use of commercial, retail and office space. Oh, but you are on mute.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Good morning all. I work for Deloitte. I head up and lead the London office crane survey, which is a survey we do which looks at the volume of office construction space built across central London, and we've been doing it for the last 24 years. I agree with a lot of what Jules said. In the last 2 quarters, so quarter 2 and quarter 3 of this year, we've seen a significant drop in leasing activity in the market. No doubt with the initial lockdown, people were just unavailable to go and visit offices in order to think about new space. And probably at the moment, if you're an office occupier that has a leasing expiry coming up, you're probably more worried about getting your people back to the office than moving. And so you've probably been thinking about extending existing leases to give yourself some sort of time to think, as a wait and see approach. We've seen availability in the office market relatively low in the last few years, which is an encouraging sign, comment that Jules was making really. The report this time, it got headlines this time because the number of new starts in the period was actually 50% down on previous, but in reality, the number of new starts is above the long-term average. It was 2.6 million square feet of new starts started in central London in the period of the last survey, which was March through to September. Typical average 2.4, so above that. We've seen construction delays, so the construction sites have struggled with COVID, and a number of sites are a quarter or 2 quarters delayed in bringing offices into the market, and so completions have reduced. In the last few years, we've seen changes in terms of who's occupying the offices, the financial sector diminishing a little, but areas such as TMT, technology, media and telecoms, has seen massive growth. And so we're seeing this change in the occupier profile across central London. And as Jules said, going forward, we expect to see the use of the offices in a slightly different way. We describe in our report this time of a hybrid working practice where people work from home and from the office, and recognise the challenges for organisations of addressing this potential new normal that we face.
Well, thank you. I think that's really interesting. I wonder if I could bring you in now, Laura, from your perspective, because I think the impacts in your area, literally geographical area, have been quite dramatic here. And I just wondered if you'd like to add something as well from your perspective.
Yes, thank you. And I absolutely agree as well with the suggestion that the immediate impacts are quite different from the longer term impacts that we'll see, because for the city, the immediate impacts have been quite dramatic. Over 80% of our businesses are in financial, professional, business services and tech, and they're industries which were already relatively used to working from home and have been able to work from home pretty successfully across this period. But at the same time, obviously, our footfall has dropped dramatically, in some instances to sort of 10% or less than what it would be normally, and that's had a huge impact on the businesses dependent on that footfall, particularly given what a low resident population we have. So we have seen a pretty dramatic immediate impact, but I think longer term it is accelerating some of the trends that we've been talking to for the last few years with companies about the changing use of office spaces. So as others have said, that push for having more collaborative spaces, more innovation spaces, consolidating under one roof, looking to bring other sorts of companies in, choosing how you co-locate with other companies that you can work with effectively. And most of the businesses that we're talking to, as Michael says, are looking to move to a more flexible model. So I don't think this is a wholesale death of the office at all. This is looking at how we reconfigure office space, how we make it work differently. And in many ways, I think if you do potentially move to that more flexible model, in some instances location becomes even more important, and the sort of things you'll look for when you're choosing that location or locations will potentially become more important as you choose.
Thank you. I think that's added something to what Michael and Jules were saying. Michele, and I have a feeling I said Michelle at the beginning. I'm so sorry, I was completely not focusing at that point. Michele, I wondered if you'd like to come in with a sort of the Economist overview here, because obviously Michael was saying in some ways things have been looking good, and yet I was listening this morning and hearing that the largest number of people have just been made unemployed between, shocking figures between August and October, I think the time frame was. And I just wondered overall what your perspective is on where we are now and where we might be going to with offices, retail.
Thank you. I mean, there's no doubt that we are going through an unprecedented economic crisis, and it only takes a cursory look to the recent scenarios that we published for London economy to see that we expect the situation, particularly in terms of employment, to get worse, unfortunately, in 2021 before it gets better. But I would definitely agree with some of the comments made by previous speakers about the fact that we just need to be a little bit cautious in projecting the current situation too far into the future. I mean, the reality is that there are a range of scenarios which are equally plausible and possible at the moment for the future of office work, and indeed for the future of the city and of how the economy of London will work, ranging from a return to something that looks more like the business as usual. It will never be exactly like the business as usual because a number of changes in behaviors and in technology are likely to be entrenched, but something that looks a little bit more like the previous business as usual, all the way to a sort of remote revolution where the importance of geography and location is significantly diminished. So there's a whole range of scenarios which I think we try to capture across the GLA group in a number of scenario projects that we take forward, including, for example, the TfL scenarios for travel in London post-COVID-19. But when you look at the attitudes of employers and indeed employees, having gone through this incredible forced experiment of 9 months of remote working, there are some signs that indeed point to the fact that both employers and employees, having experienced remote working on a large scale, can relate and appreciate some of the benefits that will come from it. I mean, there's a number that seems to come through from various surveys, quite consistently, surveys in the UK, surveys in the US, which is 70% of employees that expect not to return to a sort of 9 to 5 days a week office work pattern, but that expect to work at least for part of the time from home. And indeed, employers that expect their employees will return to the office with that kind of pattern. Again, it's not the death of the office, and as I think in the Johar and Simon Piketty put it in a recent On London blog piece, virtual networks need a place to land. It's really essential for remote teams to come together, to bond, to establish the sort of social connection and common team culture which allows them to perform. And therefore, the expectation is that office location which are easily accessible at the center of the city, which allow for the sort of interaction, will remain important. You know, you may not see rows and rows of desks. You may see many more meeting rooms and workshop rooms and informal spaces for team interaction and flexible work. And in a sense, there was a trend among some of the most sort of progressive business towards reshaping their space in that sense. Of course, there were some clear incentives to do so, also because of the cost of accommodation in London. So create space whereby you bring your employees together to work together, not to type in front of a computer, which they can do more cost effectively, potentially from a remote location or for some other office location which is not necessarily at the center of the city.
In some ways, I know that we've been sort of touching on this issue about retail and saying that there was already a revolution going on in the high street. And I think that one was a very visible one because you could see that shops were closing and new things were opening up. But my perception, and this might just be the field that I've worked in, is actually there's been a revolution going on in the office already for the last 15, probably 20 years, where, you know, a lot of people were moving over to reduce the amount of office accommodation that their business used and introducing touchdown points and hot desks all over the place. And actually that's something that we've had at the GLA, that people have had to sort of, I mean, I've been working in offices where even if I had a cellular office, I had to book my own office, as it were. Otherwise, if I just, you know, rocked up and hadn't booked it, somebody else would be in there having a meeting and I wouldn't be able to use it. So I think that, you know, this has massively accelerated that trend, and I think you're quite right to point that out. I wonder if I could bring in Jordan now. People are sort of arriving and vanishing on the screen. Thank you for that, Michele. That was really helpful. And I wondered if I could just ask you about the cost of making workplaces COVID secure. especially in the light of the ever-changing guidance about what tier we're in, whether we're locked down, whether we should be working at home, whether we should be coming into work. How much has that been costing businesses, would you say? And do you think that's going to be a bit of an impetus for people thinking about encouraging more of their staff to work at home and to have that sort of remote working option, because it's been so expensive to implement all these COVID security arrangements?
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. It's a good question, and while I don't have the exact figure, I think it runs into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and I think exacerbated by a few things, not least the supply chain shortage for all of that kit that businesses have needed for the last several months that everyone was after at the same time. So there has been enormous supply pressures. The other pressure I would list, just before I get to kind of the effect of it, is the fact that businesses were already in a holding pattern for kind of stockpiling and everything related to January 1st and the B word that we haven't quite got to that's coming around the corner. But there are businesses across London who have been in a kind of holding pattern and stockpiling and getting ready and keeping those cash reserves on the side for when they might need them. Some of those cash reserves have had to go on making their offices COVID secure or their premises COVID secure. So I would not underestimate the impact that's had on the balance sheet. And then I think you are exactly right. If you are a business sitting there saying, I've just spent, 50, 60, 70,000 pounds on kits that I never thought I'd need for my business, that I now don't even have to use because I'm encouraged to keep people away from the office, that probably stings a bit. And I think, like the Mayor said on the news this morning, whatever we feel about the rules, we do need to follow them, but it doesn't take that bitter taste, I think, out of the mouth. So there are a lot of businesses in London who are feeling that. On the kind of behavioural elements related to that, so people saying, well, we spent this, so we're going to encourage people back into the office. We haven't seen a huge amount of, I would say, dissent from businesses saying, well, we've spent this, we really want you in regardless. I think there is still a broadly good adherence to the rules. That being said, I can tell from my own experience of having popped into our office in Bank a couple of times a week since September, that there is probably more people around the city centre than you might think, I guess, in some of the harsh restrictions. So whether that's related to those offices being exceptionally well distanced and perhaps being some of the safest places in London, or whether that's related to the advent of a vaccine and people's confidence in going outside generally, it's hard to tell. But I think one thing I would say is that don't underestimate the cash that has been allocated from piles of cash that perhaps weren't aimed for this, but were aimed for another exogenous shock.
I mean, obviously, this is our last day I'll bring you in a second, Laura, because I can imagine you will want to talk about some of the things that Jordan has just touched on as well. This is our last day in Tier 2. What would you say that yesterday's announcement that at midnight tonight we're going into Tier 3 is going to mean for the businesses that you represent, Jordan?
It's going to be tough. I don't think there's any way to cut it, which isn't tough. I think the hardest hit sectors are the ones that we've been speaking about for months, so hospitality and leisure. And if this is the golden quarter, and if they need, the revenue they get from December to kind of tide them over until the spring, it looks very, very difficult for a lot of businesses to make it through to the spring. And I think under that scenario, regardless of party politics, so whichever way you cut it, firms just need to stay alive, I think. And I think in those hardest hit sectors, we would like to see a bit more support.
Oh, well, that was going to be my follow-up question is, do you feel that, we've got the support package from the Mayor and from government for businesses impacted by Tier 3? Is it going to be enough to help people get through this Christmas period, which is really not a very golden quarter this year? And in fact, we were just looking at the golden quarter at our last meeting in November and talking about it with people then. Do you think the packages are going to be enough to help people survive?
I think at this stage, it's difficult to see how they can cover everyone. I think they are, the government did move at pace earlier in the year. We will give them credit for that. And we do have unprecedented amounts of spend on things like the job retention scheme. But things like the local interruption loans could probably be beefed up. I think that as a national organisation, we look at the impact in London and we look at the impact in other cities, and we try to work with the government on things that could be broad-based enough. But it's going to be quite critical, I think, for those acute sectors in London. So I think more support, whether it's locally led or kind of nationally led, would be welcome from us.
We wrote to the Chancellor previously after hearing from businesses and also from employees earlier on in sort of the sort of June and July, August period, and we were talking about sort of targeted sectoral support because as a committee we felt that was important, and I think we would, having listened to many people now, I think we would probably still go along with that. But I'm going to bring in Laura because I think she's very keen to add to what you were saying, because I think so you have a concentration of businesses that are really impacted here, and I know that a lot of so we've had a session with Catherine McGuinness as a committee, and we know that a lot of people have been doing a lot in the city to try and make their workplaces COVID secure. So how's it landing?
Yes, absolutely. I just, absolutely wanted to expand on a couple of Jordan's points, which is that, as you say, our city businesses have spent a lot of time, effort and money making workplaces COVID secure. But when you're talking about bringing people back in, it's just worth remembering that also dramatically reduces capacity as well. So if you make your offices COVID secure, you cannot bring back in 100% of your workforce in any case. For most of the businesses we're talking to, it's maybe 20%, maybe 30%, maybe as high as 50%, depending on your actual office configuration. But it inevitably in its own right will have a natural cap on how many people you can bring back in. And the other thing just to point out, we've been surveying city firms and individuals, and it's not so much concerns about coming into the office that are holding individuals back. We're seeing huge concerns about public transport still enduring. So in one of our recent surveys, like 95% of people are most concerned about public transport, which, I mean, for the whole of London is a huge issue. For the city, it's a massive issue because well over 80% of people come in from all over London and beyond through public transport.
Yeah, I think the more that we know about the virus as well, I mean, certainly things like getting into a lift with other people, which was a point that Assembly Member Caroline Russell made before. And obviously in a very large building, if you're only putting one person in a lift, that's going to take a long time to get everybody up to the 50th floor, isn't it? So that would be quite a bit of a blow as well. And also small spaces like, use of, toilet cubicles and things like that. So there's a number of, as we learn more about it and we understand more about the droplet transmission, I think, people are sort of focusing on small spaces like being in a tube train, being on a bus, being in a lift, and so on and so forth. I think that's absolutely true. And can I bring in Rowena, please, at this point? I just wanted to ask Rowena, what you think the more sustained and permanent working from home since the start of the pandemic means for the commercial and retail properties across London. I can't see Rowena right now, but I'm sure she's there. Your mysterious initials.
Indeed. No, just to follow up on a few points already made. Yes, it is going to be very difficult for small businesses across many different sectors and in different industries coming up 1st of January and beyond. And just to follow up one of Jordan's points, I mean, where the cost of doing business, I mean, the rent quarter that is due next week is going to be very difficult for many small businesses to pay, particularly, as he was saying, hospitality and leisure, but also retail, also offices. It is incredibly difficult. And I think the point that I would make for going ahead to the future is the relationship between landlord and tenant, really. We definitely see a very one-way relationship talking to our members. It is the landlord supplies and you must pay. Really, we've been encouraging a little bit more dialogue. I mean, there has been a lot of conversation, hasn't there, about moving over for retailers to turnover rents instead of just one idea. But there's lots of different ways to change the dialogue. And it's about ways to create leverage and maybe encouraging a common best practice approach, even if we started with encouraging that amongst the biggest landlords, that then becomes something for other smaller landlords to look at. So somebody else mentioned co-locating. So the flexibility within leases to actually create new situations where we can help businesses survive and thrive. It would be a great shame, given the situation of funding at the moment, or lack of funding at the moment, or whatever's left, that so many businesses would go to the wall in the next few months simply because of that. Just to add on to that, obviously business rates relief is due to end in March. And I would say the extension of business rates relief is critical in terms of a requirement to keep businesses going in these toughest of times, to give the leeway to find the ways forward for the future.
Well, I think there's some really interesting points there, and I think I've realised why it says RF. It's because it's Rowena and then FSB, so I don't know where the H has gone for Harry. I'm actually going to pass over to my colleague Caroline Russell now, who's going to probably build on some of the points we were just making about unused office space, or using office space in new ways and creative ways, and perhaps sharing, as you just said. And I'm also going to get rid of my cat, who's decided to Zoom bomb me, as I believe the expression is, although we're on Teams. So Caroline, I'm going to pass over to you at this point.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So this is a question for Michael and for Jules and for Patrick as well. So obviously we've been hearing a lot from everyone about actually how office space, although there will be fewer people in it, there is clearly still going to be an ongoing need for office space, even if it's used differently. But this is a question about what's going to happen to the currently unused office spaces in London. Are we expecting to see a mass sell-off of the unused office space at some point in the near future, or do you see something else happening? So I don't know. Does Michael want to start? Michael Cracknell?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. So in terms of unused office space, and we talk about office availability, as I said, actually the amount of office availability across London has been very low over the last few years. If you compare back to the sort of 08-09 when we had the previous financial crisis, the availability of space was higher before it started, was much higher afterwards. So we're actually, we're starting from a good place. So that's why there's been sort of resilient leasing activity and the sort of the vibrancy of the construction market. Clearly, you're right, though, with respect to particularly the second-hand office space. So what we class as Class A rather, new build office space, very low, probably continuing to be low. But it is inevitable that as organisations reach the end of lease expiries, and this is generally the point it will happen, many organisations are not in a position to necessarily exit space just when they like, it's just too expensive. But as people get to the end of a lease expiry, yes, we anticipate particularly organisations that may have a portfolio of space or of buildings to potentially withdraw from some of those, and we do therefore see a greater level of second-hand space coming onto the market.
And is there a risk that or a potential benefit, depending on which side of the relationship of landlord and tenant that you sit, could there be a collapse in rental or property and land values, do you think, relating to that? I mean, do you think it's at that sort of scale?
No, I don't think we see. As I said, I think it's a relatively slow process because of the point around only the ability to do it at the point of a lease expiry generally. So there's a sort of it gets sort of stretched out. It gets stretched out anyway. We believe leasing demand will generally stay. Office demand will generally stay reasonably strong. So. Yes, we see an impact, but not a sort of dramatic change we would suggest.
Mm-hmm. But do you think, the point that Rowena was raising about the kind of the relationship between landlord and tenant, do you think that the kind of the sort of the COVID shock, if you like, is actually going to push over into kind of encouraging better practice between landlords and tenants? More support for those small businesses in particular.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we think actually the impact of COVID will drive what we've described as a flight to quality in terms of office space that is provided. So if you're a landlord and you have vacant space, the way in which you make that space more sort of attractive to tenants is to ensure that your space is COVID friendly, has the right facilities within your building to help that process. So we believe there is a general trend in the market to encourage environmental criteria and agenda to improve offices for people more generally, even before COVID, and that's now COVID has reinforced that situation. So we see developers and landlords looking at how they can improve workspace environments to meet those requirements. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just bringing in Jules and possibly Patrick. I'm not sure how you want to split this off between you, but whether what your perspective is on this issue of the currently unused office space, and also whether you've got views on how this vacated space should actually be being used, sort of as we move forward out of this particular moment.
Yeah, I don't want to add to what Michael said, not disagree with any of it. I mean, a lot of areas of London have seen huge pressure, because although what Michael said was sort of the average across London, there are obviously pockets where, that occupancy is very high and driving up rents, before COVID impacted. And I think we will see a return to that situation in some locations, particularly tech sectors, life sciences as well. Big pressure on life sciences space. We're seeing a lot of clusters being brought forward in London, which is it's a version of office space. They have some particular requirements about layout and technical kit in terms of air handling and fume cupboards and all that kind of thing, some of them, and also floor loadings as well for technical equipment. But it's a specialist section of office space, effectively, and they want to be clustered in places that we would often see office space, such as King's Cross, and around Euston. So I think we will see continued growth in those kind of sectors, and also I think the government's increasing introduction of permitted development rights and changes that they'd like to see, whether in the London plan or changes that they want to bring in over the next 3 or 4 years in the changes to approach to planning. All are going to put quite a pressure on what we used to know as B1C, sort of office space and light industrial space, and an awful lot of that again looks like offices, sort of B1A. Creative industries, recording industries. It involves a lot of kind of sort of desktop activity in a kind of creative atmosphere with meeting space, and that very kind of space is what is at danger of being lost under these kind of different sort of attacks, under whether it be permitted development rights, or whether just the general pressure to flip commercial space into housing. So I think this is another thing to factor in about, it's not just demand, it's also about the continued pressure that's creating a loss of this kind of space.
So do you think there's anything that you can be doing that can actually protect that kind of space? I mean, this committee's heard many times from organisations like the Federation of Small Business, the sort of the people working in railway arches, the need for that kind of space. Is there anything, if you can see a sort of pressure on those kind of slightly more marginal spaces as, all of this COVID stuff shakes out, is there anything you can do to protect those smaller businesses and make sure that they can access space and affordably? Because I think that's what we heard from Rowena just now, was it was about that relationship between the landlord and the tenant and the need for that relationship to shift.
I'll give three things. Firstly, very practical, what the Mayor is doing through TfL in terms of the arches that TfL own, and I think the approach that TfL has taken there with its arch businesses has been compared favourably to others and in that sector. And the charter that exists between TfL and its tenants. There's all the work that the GLA regeneration team have been doing, the sort of a good growth agenda, which looks to create sort of a polycentric, encouraging a polycentric city. The sort of promotion of mixed use in the way we approach localities across London, and then finally. And ultimately, the way that's expressed, particularly that second thing, the good growth agenda, how that's expressed in the London plan. The draft that we sent in now a year ago, as I'm sure you remember when it came to the Assembly, it's very strong on the preservation and future creation of business space, particularly light in industrial, B1C, but also B1A. As I say, there's a lot of created industries that are more kind of office space than a large dirty shed. And what the mayor is continuing to do is ensuring that those policies still remain sufficiently robust in the plan. And that although obviously the mayor's does have this priority of getting homes built, it can't be at the expense of places for people to work.
Thank you. Now, I think in September, the mayor announced he was doing some research looking at the future challenges and opportunities facing central London and Canary Wharf. So what is that research hoping to achieve, and who's being consulted, and how will the results be disseminated and acted on? That was for you, Jules.
Right. Well, I mean, the project obviously stems from recognition that the ongoing success of the CAS is absolutely essential, not just for London, but it is also essential for the whole of the UK economy. So the Central Activity Zone, the Northern Isle of Dogs, and that whole kind of fringe that extends half a mile or so around those central areas. I mean, it's responsible for about half of London's economic output, something like 13% of the whole of the national economic output. So it's essential that activity is able to be restored. Huge challenges, obviously, at the moment: lack of commuters, total lack of tourism, lack of national visitors as well as international visitors, and it is this kind of agglomeration of economic activity that makes it work, and also that makes it attractive. The fact that the city is successful, people want to locate here from all around the world. It is the complex offer, an ecosystem that London offers that puts it, the number one, that places it as the number one global city. So the analysis that we've commissioned from Arup is looking sort of, at emerging trends across key sectors, looking at what are the key functions that make up the CAS, looking at what relies on the existence of those central functions, the obvious things being all those support things like, last minute printing, sandwich shops, dry cleaners. It's the interrelationship between all this, between all these things. It's not going to look at the CAS just in isolation, but sort of see how it fits with the whole of the London and national economy. It's going to look at scenarios because we haven't got, sadly, a crystal ball. So really, it's got to look at different scenarios so that we're ready depending on the way things pan out. So that's kind of the broad thrust of it.
And sorry, when are the results? When is it going to be published? And will we start to see any action coming from it?
Timescale, Patrick. Can you help me on the timescale?
Yeah, I can jump in here, and in fact, Michele might be well placed to comment because he's involved working with the Arab team. But the research is in two strands. One is an analysis of scenarios and trends, and the second element is beginning to look at the policy levers which we might have in London to affect the sorts of changes that the scenarios indicate may be coming. We're expecting a March delivery of the research. I don't know if Michele, you're better placed to provide anything further on that.
I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, just to add in terms of stakeholder and involvement of external experts, I mean, clearly the ultimate customer is the London Recovery Board, which is a partnership that goes beyond the GLA and it goes beyond local government. It's got people from business, academia, and so on. And therefore, you know, the recommendation will not just be a recommendation from the GLA, presumably will be a number of actions for central government, local government, business, and so on. But also just to mention that the research itself will be informed by a number of focus groups and workshops with businesses and external experts. And also there's an independent expert panel that has been appointed to provide steer on the project, which includes Greg Clark, formerly of LEAP, Yolande Barnes, professor of real estate, Philip Rod, who's executive director of LSE Cities, and Zubaida Haq, who's former director of the Runnymede Trust. So hopefully it's going to be a project which is very much open to external expertise and perspectives.
Thank you. I was just about to hand back to the chair, but I can see Laura's got her hand up. Did you want to comment on this in particular?
Yes, I'd just like to flag two pieces of research that we'd be very keen to feed into this, if at all possible. So we've got a major piece, London Recharged, working with Oliver Wyman and Arup, that was published a few weeks ago, that looks very much, as you say, about that package of things that are necessary. I mean, not just for recovery, but actually for, you know, sort of a really thriving future, because at the end of the day, this isn't just about COVID, it is about making sure we've got the right business ecosystem, infrastructure, global openness, business environment, talent, quality of life, amenities, etc. And we are now internally doing a piece looking at also what that means for the city. So just to say, we'd be very keen to feed in and share those insights.
Yeah. I mean, if I can come back quickly, clearly London Recharge is already feeding into that because it's the same team of consultants that did the study. But by all means, send through anything that's relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, handing back to you. You're still muted.
Oh, rookie mistake. So we're now going to, sorry, my cat was making noises, so I actually did put myself on mute. I don't normally do that in the middle of the meeting. We're now going to move on to, thank you for that, Caroline. We're going to move on from some questions now from Sean Bailey, and he's going to start questioning probably with Rowena, and we'll then move on to a number of other guests. So Sean, over to you.
Good morning, all. Before I start, Laura, would it be possible to get a copy of that report? That sounds like something we'd like to see. If you come through the chair, I'm sure she'll disseminate that report. Thank you. Secondly, morning, I'm going to address my first question to Arena. I think in a way, Arena, I'm asking a slightly obvious question in what will happen to those retail and hospitality businesses in central London locations that rely on office workers for most of their income.
Well, I think in full honesty, there is just going to be a lot of businesses failing, and I think we're going to see an increase even more than we've seen already in January and February. Just anecdotally from my own experience, where I have a retail shop in central London on our street, which has 2 large offices, the coffee shop has already closed down, and you see that across different parts of London a lot. However, it's not just about large offices feeding small businesses who are doing, say, daytime trading in cafes and coffee shops and stuff like that. The impact is much wider. Commuters and office workers don't just provide lunchtime sandwich retailers with business. They feed into a lot of other kinds of retail too, and hospitality as well. That after work and dining out, which London is famous for, and so many of us have enjoyed. There is no doubt about it that hospitality and leisure is an industry that is hit much harder than many others. And I would say those that have struggled through the first lockdown have tried to adapt, have tried to reopen, as Jordan has said, have spent a lot of money outlaying to make themselves, to manage the risk. They have taken avail of every possible grant that they can, but that is absolutely still not enough. Having missed out on a key trading period through October, November, December, which would have got you through paying your December quarterly rent and then got you through the quieter periods of January and February until the weather begins to change, that's simply not going to be there. Cash flow is absolutely critical in small businesses in January and February, and that is one of the main reasons why you're going to see more fail in January and February than you may have done in the months preceding. There is also Brexit to consider. There is also the fact that many companies have been hanging on. They've been trying their best in the expectation that this is going to be over at some point soon. And then again and again, we've met cliff edges and we've met new restrictions and harsher restrictions, which is meaning it is just becoming less viable commercially to do business, but also small business owners are worn out. It is something that is incredibly hard to keep a company going and to keep all your staff on and not make redundancies. And meanwhile, let's not forget there's been no grant support for directors of companies. So there's nothing to actually pay yourself to support you and your family whilst you are trying to keep your business going and all your staff in employment. So there is a toll on small business owners too, I would say. So all of that is coming together at a critical time when bounce back loans may have run out, CBILS may have been earmarked for everything. It is going to be a really tough time, Sean, and we are going to see a lot of businesses go to the wall. And it's really important that we give them hope for a future recovery, so that even if they're meeting the most terrible times in January, February that might make them consider throwing in the towel, there's got to be hope for the future of something that they can move on to.
Okay. I mean, you're right. I've spoken to a number of small business owners, and one of the things that comes with a conversation is the personal toll of having to make these big decisions for their own families and other people's families as well. It's a real worry there. I think I just want to slightly modify the question and talk about, we've talked about a remote revolution, we've talked about the city looking significantly different. Is that weighing on the mind of small businesses, not knowing, even if we return to full trading, what that trading may look like? Because a lot of the conversation we've had this morning would suggest maybe a smaller footfall and at least a different footfall. Are small businesses in a position to even think about that at this time?
Absolutely. I'd say small businesses have been thinking about it for the last few years because we've been facing uncertainty with the question of a Brexit for a number of years now. COVID has merely added to that. And I would say small businesses are fantastic because they have that ability to be flexible and pivot and respond maybe much quicker and much more agilely than other larger organizations. But that can also give way to a certain amount of wheel spinning in terms of scenario planning. So it can be quite hard where they're expending energy trying to constantly think, as you're saying, Sean, of what to do next. But in fact, as many other people today have already presented, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We really don't know what the timeline is going to be. And a lot of people are still focused on resilience right now rather than recovery for the future. But I will say that in terms of recovery for the future, the main conversation that I have heard most recently is actually around childcare. I think there has been a lot of talk, a lot of looking at people's quality of life, just from the fact that you may not be commuting to work and you are working from home, for instance. As small businesses look to the future and if and when they return to an office space or, what's happening with their retail shop or if they're relocating their business or light industry needing to, or manufacturing needing to extend a lease, people are looking to the future. And what they are concerned about is things like quality, affordable childcare, because they need to be focused on their business and its recovery and its growth in the future, rather than worrying about what is the placement of where their children are and who's looking after them. And I think that really feeds into a much wider thing, because with COVID, there's been much more focus on local provision, hasn't there? There's been everything from shop local to focus on neighbourhoods and boroughs and everything else. So I'm going to add not just quality, affordable childcare, but quality, affordable, local childcare. And I think that can't be underestimated in its importance to the future recovery. And as such, we've mentioned earlier the COVID, the Mayor's Recovery Board, and actually now there's the COVID Business Board, who have produced a roadmap, and childcare is actually mentioned on that roadmap as a key item.
Okay, thank you. Can I just come to Jules on this question, please, Jules? Do London's commercial centres, particularly the central activity zone, need to be reimagined, repurposed? And if so, what's the Mayor's role in doing this? Because we've had lots of conversations this morning about a different way of working, a different use of office space, new, more flexible office space, co-location, all kinds of things. Does that also mean a redesign physically for the central activity zone in particular, and central London in general?
I think in terms of a redesign, in terms of public space, I think the phrase redesign it would be appropriate, and that was perhaps something that was needed even without COVID, and the City of London has been quite in the vanguard of pedestrianisation. We all know that the Mayor would very much like to have seen the Oxford Street pedestrianised, and I think that need is just as relevant as today and in the future as it was a year ago, and to reimagine the use of the connecting space between buildings to adapt to the new reasons why people might want to go to such a location and do their shopping. It's more about an experience now than simply bang bang bang, shop shop shop, in out, carrying carrier bags of merchandise. That isn't the way people want to behave anymore. So I think there is a reimagining in that sense. I think perhaps the actual buildings themselves, it will be more gradual as people bring them on for redevelopment, or as, say, as John Lewis has decided, they want to reduce the number of floors that they have for retail space. So that needs a reimagining. I mean, does it mean just a separate lift round the back off a side street that goes up to the few floors above, or is there something more bold or more subtle in the way that it introduces office space into that retail centre? I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I, as being obviously a major contributor to the London plan, on behalf of the Mayor, but I think it's all in there. I'm quite often asked, does the London plan need revision before it's even been finally published? And actually, no. All this is in there about the need to sort of to these things that we need to bear in mind as we look at renewing space, whether, as I say, it's connecting space or office space itself.
Okay. So what's the Mayor's short-term and long-term measures to enable positive recovery across the city? We've talked about something medium into the long term. What's a short-term effect? What's a short-term tactic, things that the Mayor can do right now?
Well, I mean, you've heard mention earlier of the roadmap, and that's all about a safe and full reopening of London's economy over the next 12 months. But it's very hard to kind of set the, to start the firing gun on that when we're in such a stop-start situation with the, with the effects, the immediate effects of the pandemic. But that plan, has four themes to it. There's a communications element, public health element, business support, and also consideration about the licensing, planning, and enforcement issues. And that looks across the whole piece of short-term coming out of lockdown, the sort of the issues that we have about coming in and out of tiers in the way that we are doing. It covers issues about what local government should be doing, national government, and then sort of a medium term that's looking at transition to the longer term. Again, many issues for all levels of government. I mean, there's quite an extensive list, sort of 30 or 40 points that we think that the national and regional and local government need to be taking into account over the next 12 months as we emerge from the tier 3s and the lockdowns that we're in.
Thank you. Just a little tweak to that for the final question in this sector. How will the London Recovery Board engage with Londoners to shape the city's recovery? You've talked about the action plan and all the points on it, but we're recovering from COVID-19. As a Londoner, how will you be having that conversation with me? If I own a business, a big or small one, just as a citizen in London, how are the board communicating?
Obviously that sort of business plays a significant role in the overarching boards of recovery, of which, to do it justice, I would need a PowerPoint slide with the interconnecting groups that operate on this. But the short answer to your question would be that all the recovery missions that are in place, there are 9 recovery missions being put in place, and the oversight of those has representatives from across civil society, as well as business. So whether it's faith groups, the voluntary and community sector, and so on, all the people you would expect to be on such a pan-London body representing all sectors. And in turn, there's been consultation. There was a great deal of consultation on the missions, for example, that was undertaken. We could let you have the chapter and verse of the reach that consultation had in forming the missions. I see Patrick nodding. Maybe he wants to expand on that.
I mean, I was just going to add that you're right, Jules. Under the auspices of each of the missions, there's an incredible amount of engagement, either that's happening, or is planned. So I'm involved in the High Street School mission that forms part of the Recovery Board's programme, and we have a whole programme of activity lined up through Talk London. We have done engagement with every single London borough, who are in turn preparing their own more localised engagement strategies, because and you've heard this, I'm sure, on a number of occasions. The recovery programme is about harnessing the power of London's local authorities as well as it is about using city government to try and effect some change. And it's local authorities who can really engage their constituents, their citizens best, enabled by some strategic messaging from City Hall.
Thank you for that.
And that actually, Chair and Sean, I mean, Patrick has mentioned high streets for all there, which we have concentrated quite a fair bit on the CAS and related issues, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, which I know the committee doesn't generally, but it would be remiss of me if I didn't press the fact that there's an awful lot of focus as well going on about the reinvigoration of high streets across the whole of London, inner and outer, as well as this very big piece of work focusing on the CAS.
Thank you.
Sean, I know we're going to move on to another group of questions with you, but we've had a request from Navin that he's able to come in and just follow up on this set of questions before you move on about migration, if that's okay. And also, thank you. And I also just need to say that Jules has just sent me a message to say that he needs to go at 11:15 because the mayor is demanding his assistance at a meeting with, may I say who it's with, Jules, just so that people understand? It's with the Secretary of State. So obviously Jules has been with us since 10 and now has to go at 11:15. I think we'll accept it because it's the Mayor and the Secretary of State. Obviously we would rather you stayed with us, but we understand we're being gazumped.
I do apologise, Chair.
No, but we do understand.
Apology accepted.
Apology is accepted. Navin, I'm going to bring you in now, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
I have unmuted, Chair, and thank you. Jules, you were absolutely right. You mentioned Outer London and talking about high streets, because quite rightly we're discussing a situation with central activity zones, but like you said, town centre, which in Outer London, town centres, your district local district centres, etc., were already taking quite a deal of hammering before COVID, before the pandemic. So we got to make sure that the focus is also there. Enough, all the efforts are made to see how the town centres, your local district centres in Outer London are also looked at in terms of whether you call it reinvention or looking at repurposing them. And that is where I want to know what specific work is being done to revive and reinvent those areas which need a lot of support, particularly given the pandemic situation and how the way of working and living itself is changing.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're absolutely right. It is changing and was changing before COVID. As I said, I'm a firm believer that the plan doesn't need altering, because it was very much in favour of creating sort of a mixed developments that did offer workspace as well as residential accommodation above. All industrial sites apart from heavy industry, particularly those kind of B1C type sites behind high streets, that the plan is very much focused on not losing the employment space on the ground floor, but building a couple of stories or so above, more if the location can bear it. So the long-term planning framework, I believe, is in place to help high streets, and more immediately, as part of the recovery, as I mentioned, this high streets mission, which I'm sure Patrick can expand on. But the ambition is that is for us to help every single borough develop an exemplar scheme, one that would demonstrate more widely to the borough about the possibility. I think we're well positioned on this. That before COVID, we had been working on what was called the sort of adaptive high streets strategy, which wasn't it was the exact opposite of a one-size-fits-all. It was how could the GLA help boroughs, help high streets, help bids, and so on, look at pivoting their high streets into a new offer for the future. COVID has simply made the work sort of acute rather than chronic, or as well as chronic. And the high streets mission is kind of a crisis extension of that, sort of a call to arms to kind of crack on and do what we wanted to do anyway, about the reinvigoration of high streets. As I say, it's as retail decreases, then we need to be more imaginative about the spaces that exist there. Patrick, I mean, you can build on that.
Jules, before we move on.
Sorry, Jules. Sorry, and Navin as well. I'm sorry to not bring Patrick in, but if we've only got you for another 5 minutes, Jules, I actually don't want to hear from Patrick right now, but we can hear him just after you've got. Sorry, Navin. There's some questions that Sean has got next. I brought you in with that one. I don't want Sean to not be able to put his next group of questions to Jules, and then we'll come back to you and you can put your further points to Patrick, if you don't mind. Because otherwise Sean is going to lose the opportunity to question Jules. And I think it's really important that, that Sean is able to put his questions. So if you want to go to the next ones about the relocation, and perhaps you could pick up Susan's question on engagement with businesses and organisations, Sean, as well, just while Jules is just here. I'm sorry to do that to you as well, Susan.
Jules, in the interest of time, I'm going to conflate a few things, crush a few things together, and you can just give us an overall statement. This is really focused on, do Londoners and London business want to stay in London? That's a general theme what I'm asking here. Because, of course, there's some research that will say that lots of people, businesses as well, are relocating out of London as a result of the pandemic and other commercial pressures, just the sheer cost of running business in London. And, you know, what will the mayor do to ensure that London remains attractive so we can keep our competitiveness? And are we at risk of a brain drain in London? Now, I know I've asked you a number of things there, Jules, so please pick out the ones that jump out to you the most.
Wow. Yeah, so it's a lot in one place. There's I mean, obviously there are surveys and things that suggest, I've seen figures around sort of 90+% of businesses say that they intend to stay in London. It's in single figures that say that they contemplating moving. That's still hugely serious. If someone said, oh, 10%, you know, 2 years ago, someone said 10% of London's businesses would go out of business or leave London. That's a serious issue. So I'm not making light of it, but that's probably about the size of it.
Concentrate on this for me then, Jules. What can we do to make sure that London remains attractive?
Yeah.
There are a number of challenges coming, Brexit, pandemic, etc.
Rather than try and list all the things that the mayor is doing, because we've touched on some of those and the recovery plan and everything, the essence of your question about its attractiveness, I think it will always continue to be an attractive, leading, you know, the #1 world-class city. When you look at its legal system, its language, its education system, the concentration of leading higher education institutions, you look at the number of planning applications at a very high level we're continuing to get for hotels and for student accommodation, would indicate that certainly internationally and investors see London continuing to be an absolute world leading centre for people to come to, whether it's to visit, whether it's to come here for 3 years and be a student. That probably goes towards your brain drain issue as well. I wouldn't expect that at all. I think in the long term, we've got every reason to be confident. You know, London has been here thousands of years. It has suffered huge issues, whether it be disease, war, whatever, in the past. I'm absolutely confident, the mayor is confident, we will bounce back. We should, though, the work to be done is ensuring that we bounce back, we come back better than we did before. We don't make the same mistakes as we have done before in the way that we work, the way that we lay things out. We should try and take advantage of the situation to, you know, it's becoming a bit of a hackneyed phrase now, but build back better.
Okay, I'm conscious, Jules, that we have probably come to the end of the time when we can keep you until. I think, Sean, there are still a few points at the end of the briefing as well that we were planning. We've got a series of questions that we've sort of put together, Jules, obviously, as you'll appreciate. If we write to you afterwards,
I was going to suggest that. Please do. Please do. I mean, I'm anything regen and recovery mission. I'm sure Patrick more than capable than I am of answering it. But I mean, on the skills side, by all means, anything. Do write. Take it as an opportunity to write, and I'll come back to the committee.
Thank you. And we will pester Patrick and Michele for some answers ongoing as well. But thank you very much, and I'm sorry you've got to rush away, but I hope it's
I'm sorry too. Thank you for the committee's understanding. Thank you.
Successful meeting.
Chair, you can let Navin come back in.
Yes, I was going to say, if we bring Navin back in now, because I cut you off in your prime, Navin, but if you'd like to come back in, and perhaps we can bring in Patrick. If you did you grasp the point that Navin was just doing his questioning on? Patrick, do you want him to restate it?
Chair, can I, before, in order for Patrick to give me a full response to what else I was going to ask Jules, and that is about, well, sticking to outer London areas specifically, don't forget that apart from the plight of the town and district centres, you also got issues about the vision of opportunity and intensification areas. Do you reckon that in the light of where we are, is there any need to have a rethink, reimagination, revaluation of the opportunity areas as well as intensification areas? Because those are about major regeneration in outer London areas, but impacting on whole of the London as such. Yeah, so I'd like a reply on that as well, and some, I mean, specifically what is being done to encourage local shopping. I know councils are doing that, but how can the GLA, how can the mayor assist to promote local shopping and local revival of those high streets? Thank you, Patrick.
Okay, there's a few things there. If I sort of return to the broader high street question, there is an incredible amount of work that's going on at the minute. We've identified a range of things that we could really start to motor on to address some of the economic restructuring that's now happening at more breakneck speed than it might have happened without the impact of the pandemic. There is a big question around data. We know that lots of our local places need better access to data. What we've heard loud and clear from local authorities during the pandemic, that access to and understanding about where vacancy rates are, what the trends are in their occupancy, what their footfall data looks like, how people are moving around their town centres and their places is now much more important than it ever was. And we at the GLA are working on a project to look at how we can collectively access some of that data and make it available to local authorities to provide better insights that then inform policy decisions. Elsewhere within the policy framework space, Jules touched on some of the planning conditions. The London Plan sets the sort of framework within which we think lots of positive things can happen in town centres and high streets. There are some things on the horizon that cause concern. PDR causes, big concern for London, but particularly for our high streets, because what we could see is the sort of eroding of commercial uses without the planning authority having the ability to sort of take a view. And the latest consultation on PDR provides even greater concern. There are particular conditions in London where you know that the use class that's going to have the highest value in most places is going to be residential ahead of other things. You made a point, Navin, about OAPFs, opportunity areas, and whether there's a need for reconsideration. There are now 43, I believe. They're all very different. If you look at opportunity area planning frameworks, some of them are big swathes of areas like the Upper Lee Valley. Others are tightly defined bits of CAS in some places, like around Euston or around Victoria. So there are different answers in every context. We are doing a piece of work across all the spatial development functions within the GLA family to look at what level of involvement we have and what we might need to have. We know that, for instance, in places where the development and regeneration of an area is contingent on a big bit of infrastructure kit, and Crossrail 2, Bakerloo Line extension, we know now that the ability to deliver those infrastructure schemes is going to be even more challenging than it was previously, because of the plight of TfL's funding model, and the ability that London is going to have to attract infrastructure investment is going to be more challenging than perhaps it had been previously. So there is a job to do to review some of our opportunity areas and look at whether the prospect for them developing in the way that we envisaged now changes in light of new circumstances. But by and large, the frameworks, as Jules was setting out in terms of the plan and in terms of the opportunity area planning frameworks themselves, provide the scope for different flexibilities, different scenarios to play out. There was a third, I think there might be a third element to your question. I'm not sure if you feel that covers everything.
I'm content with that. Chair, can I very, very briefly see if Rowena would like to respond in terms of plight of small businesses in outer London areas, and what is her or organizational position in terms of how those small, medium-sized businesses can be supported given now where we are.
We have. I'm clearly you're here in. I know, but we have discussed this actually in a couple of previous meetings. I don't like to cut you off in your prime, but Navin, this is not your. I know you're here as a substitute for Unmesh, so we have discussed this before. And what we were hoping to focus on next was the area of relocation away from London, rather than talking about the issues relating to the central activity zone and the outer London issues again, which we have explored in some detail in a previous meeting that you weren't with us for, Navin. So I'm afraid I am actually going to go back to Sean Bailey now, and we're going to come to we're going to go back to the issue of relocation and keeping London attractive and brain drain and that whole area. So sorry to cut you off now, Navin, but we're going to go back to Sean. Sean, because otherwise we're never going to finish the areas that we have agreed to cover today.
I'll try to be swift. Let me come to Laura. How does the movement of business as a result of COVID-19, has that led to business moving away? Sorry, you seem to be waving at me, Caroline. I can't hear you, Caroline.
Which Caroline? Sorry, Caroline.
Russell.
Sean, you were just moving on to one of the questions I was going to be asking, but you were going to be asking Jordan Cummings the question 2.2, 2.3 and 2.4.
Down to 2.4. Okay, I'll go back. I have 2.4 on my list.
So you had that chunk of questions, Sean.
Okay. Yeah. Are you, again, I addressed this to Laura. Are you concerned about London businesses leaving the capital for other parts of the country due to the COVID-19? There's been a lot of talk of that. Is that talk well founded?
So, I mean, I think you're right that location decisions are absolutely critical, and actually, given the current context, both in terms of London, but also looking at the global picture as well. So not just London and the rest of the UK, but London and other European centres or other global centres as well, both in terms of at the business level, why have a workplace and why have it in London? And of course, at the individual level, why choose to come to London, live in London, work in London? And it's worth saying we are starting, of course, from a very strong starting point. I mean, London is consistently ranked as one of the best places to do business, to live, to work. And sort of making sure that we absolutely retain those strengths is critical. We haven't at the moment seen businesses making large decisions. So I know, given your sort of focus on workspace at the moment, most of the businesses that we've been talking about, given the level of uncertainty around COVID, have been doing things that are more flexible. So perhaps looking at reconfiguration of spaces, looking at perhaps extending leases a little bit, sort of giving them a bit more time and space to think about it. But we certainly haven't seen a mass migration. Obviously, some of the effects of COVID are yet to come through. So, for example, business deaths have been very low across the year, but are now starting to get much, much higher as government support measures get phased out. But we haven't seen anything that looks like a mass outflow at the moment. That doesn't, of course, mean we can be complacent. And so we are doing a lot of work, as I say, through London Recharged, through some London benchmarking work we're doing, and through the City Recovery Task Force to make sure that we can keep that breadth of offer that brings people here. So, you know, on the personal side, the sort of the freedom of movement, the openness, the amenities, the quality of life. For businesses, there is the workplace, but there's also the wider business environment, of course. So the regulatory environment, the legal environment, the sorts of things that make here a really good place to do business. And very happy to either expand on any of those or pick up with you perhaps subsequently.
We'll do, but I want one small question because I'm trying to aid the chair with time. Are we attracting any new business because other financial hubs around the world are having their issues? Are we attracting any new business?
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, it's interesting because we were, of course, not the only people facing these issues. And so you've seen, I think, actually, perhaps far fewer businesses leaving than you might have expected, or far fewer workers leaving than you might have expected, for example, due to Brexit. And we've just started to see an uptake in business births. So we're suddenly seeing new businesses start up after quite a long period of that being below normal levels for the year. So I think, you know, we are quite optimistic in terms of the businesses that we've been talking to, which, you know, despite the very challenging times, we are seeing new businesses come in and start up again.
Okay, thank you. Chair, I'll go back to you so you can move on.
Okay, so we're moving on from Assembly Member Sean Bailey to Assembly Member Caroline Russell, although I agree with Caroline, you did appear to be slightly going into Caroline's questions, but you sort of withdrew, but then still asked the question to Laura. So I suspect Caroline might be coming back to you again, Laura, now.
Yes, just briefly. I'm also interested, actually, whether Jordan Cummins has anything to say on those questions that Sean was just asking, just about to get that to get your position on the business of businesses leaving the capital for other parts of the country. You know, is that something that you're concerned about?
Yeah, so I mean, we'd echo pretty much everything that Laura said, and I think it was said earlier. It's, you know, if it's 1 in 10, that doesn't seem like a lot, but a trickle could become a flood quicker than you think. So I don't think we should rest on our laurels in terms of London's position. We did some stats. We did some research to get some stats in November, and actually the majority of businesses that we polled in partnership with Ipsos said that they were planning to stay in their current offices or near to their current offices. So I don't think we're looking at the kind of flood immediately. One interesting thing I think to consider is the role of property and housing and the impacts that has on not just the workforce, but then subsequently that has on management, because they are looking at this more so than they probably ever have before, I would say, at board level. And from some of our real estate members, we've seen kind of growth in inner city housing for apartments where there's no need for a commute, and then outer city housing where you can have more space in a garden, and everything in that kind of middle band, which is exceptionally expensive, but perhaps also still requires a commute, has seen a bit of a dip from them. So I think the changes in residential movement are quite interesting to us as well. One thing that I would just say, and I know we're coming on to this section, is you know, London as a major global city will have issues, and you can solve them individually, but when you group them together, so whether it's housing or transport costs, you know, the legal environment that Laura mentioned, changes in regulation, Brexit, crime perhaps, when you group them together as an international investor, sometimes it looks worse than perhaps you would look at them individually. So I would just think about London's issues in the round from an investor's perspective, looking at whether or not this is the best place to kind of set up. But we haven't seen that kind of mass exodus in the same way as Laura said.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yes, back to Laura, and Sean has already touched on the concerns about London businesses leaving the city and setting up in other parts of Europe due to Brexit mainly, but also to the COVID crisis. So there's that, but also, do you think that there could be a fundamental shift away from the city as a kind of, as partly as other parts of London develop their business districts? Is there are you worried at all that the City of London might no longer be the absolute sort of financial and business hub of London?
I think that when you look at the kind of question of why have an office, why come to a workplace, why come to a location, and we have talked to businesses, large and small, a lot about this, why come to the city, why locate in the square mile, what's driving their location decisions. A lot of the factors that underpin those are not going to become less important as a result of the changes, and they might become more important. So, you have the connectivity, the ability to bring large numbers of people in, and of course that's partly your workforce, given what a huge catchment area London and the city have for its workers and the talent, but also bringing in, investors, clients, people in similar fields, colleagues from overseas. Obviously, that's taken a hit as a result of COVID, but I don't think there's a suggestion that you will not want to see people interact, have those face-to-face meetings. Part of the sort of the clustering, the connectivity, the creativity, the collaboration that comes from bringing people together. The sheer density, the agglomeration that the city has as one of the densest business districts in the world has always been seen by the people who locate here as sort of hugely important in terms of that knowledge transfer, the access to all sorts of different firms, businesses, Bank of England, regulators, the ability to be able to talk and to interact and communicate regularly. And then there are the amenities, and that's important wherever you locate across London. But we've seen an increased focus over the last few years, both from businesses who do want to create high quality working environments for their staff, which, as other people have said, means that sort of shift away just from rows of desks and more collaborative spaces, more on offer within the office, but also local to you. So for and that sort of network of small businesses that make this so important. So, you know, having access, frankly, to cafes, to gyms, to restaurants, to transport hubs, the things that sort of allow people to have a sort of quality of life in and around work as well. Obviously, the city isn't the only place that offers those. There are sort of plenty of good clusters within London that do, but we don't think those strengths are going to go away. And we're also increasingly focused, as many of you know, I think, on aspects that will make the city a more pleasant place to come into, like, as some have commented, around the sort of sustainability and the sort of quality of the environment we're offering.
Yes, no, certainly been very impressed by the new work you're doing on freight delivery and getting all everything done either on foot or by bike. That's really making a difference in terms of the street environment for people coming in. Michael, did you want to come in on this point?
Michael,
yes, thank you, Caroline. Yeah, just to say, in terms of the city and looking at our report, for years now, the amount of development in the city outstrips anywhere else in the rest of London. It's the area where you can build tall, where you can put sizable developments. We have seen, on the back of financial services sort of seeking to sort of save money in the last few years, some sort of small decline in the amount of construction. But ironically, the reason why our report was suggesting that decline had gone down 50% this year is because in the last period we'd had two speculative massive schemes start in the city, which was a massive vote for the city. So, and I think on top of that, what the city we're seeing is doing is actually, as it did when we saw Canary Wharf, is reinventing itself in terms of the sort of the organisations that the city is able to attract. So yes, of course, it remains the sort of the heart of the financial district, but it also now attracts, and you think about the sort of the fringes of the city in particular, it absolutely sort of attracts the sort of the TMT type organisations. And one further thing in terms of the sort of London, versus the sort of the rest of the world, a Deloitte report a year or two back looked at sort of Power Up, a report looking at London, and showed that London was massively attractive compared to any other European centre in terms of sort of secondary headquarters and that type of thing. And I think the growth of TMT has actually allowed London to be a really significant place for fintech. So fintech is the sort of the leap between the financial services and technology. And nowhere else in the world can you sort of, go and talk to your TMT clients, but also talk to your sort of financial clients in the same city. You can't do that in America because it's on two different sides of the sort of the area. So London retains some of this sort of special status in terms of having that attraction for, new and evolving businesses that are sort of taking the place of perhaps some of the more traditional ones.
Thank you. Chair, I'll hand back to you at that point. We're at 2.7.
Okay, thank you very much. We're moving on to some questions from Susan Hall now, Assembly Member Susan Hall. And I'm really pleased to tell the committee and also Susan, because she has one of her questions, which I know she was hoping to put to Jules, but Jules has been able to rejoin us. So I'm going to bring in Susan now. And Susan, do, if you want to put the question that Sean quickly tried to wrap up into his earlier on, if you do want to put that question now to Jules, do so. Over to Susan Hall. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's good news for us all. Thank you. But in the meantime, can I ask, first of all, Michael, going on from what you were just saying to Caroline's previous questions, it's good to know that any businesses going are being replaced by those other businesses. But what actions need to be taken to mitigate businesses planning to leave London, both by the government and the mayor, to ensure that London's global competitiveness carries on in the future?
I think in terms of, we've seen some of the financial sector sort of reorganise itself, and this is about finding lower cost bases to work, so sort of outsourcing, offsourcing, and so some of the larger financial institutions have moved to some of our regional centres and some of its back office type facilities. And in a sense, it's almost the success of London that London, it's a sort of a finite space. Organisations respond to that, and and put the most significant sort of operations in the centre of London, and as they grow, they move some of their other operations out. So, in general, I think the sort of the success of London has been to sort of push some of this sort of evolution that naturally occurs, which is perhaps not a terrible thing. And it has allowed. I mean, even if we talk about now going forward in terms of if we all spend less time per week in the office and we spend 2 days at home or whatever the new normal works out to be, ultimately that will release space back into the market and allow more businesses to have London as its home. So that will take a little time, but that's actually quite a positive story going forward.
It is indeed. And Jules, if I can bring you in, please. Jules, what specific assessment has there been on the possibility of many young Londoners choosing to leave London, primarily, of course, for cheaper accommodation, and the potential for London to lose, thus, a great deal of skills and talent?
I'm afraid I'd have to get back to the committee on that, on any specific research. That hasn't come under me at all, so I haven't been aware of that. But we can find out that and write to the committee.
That's great, thank you, I'd be grateful. Jules, also in the Financial Times on the 23rd of November, there was an article exploring whether or not increased working from home could lead to companies potentially offshoring some of their operations, thus also potentially causing unemployment in the UK. Do you get any sense that there may be a problem in London regarding this?
No, it's not something that a threat that we have that's been raised with us so far. I mean, a lot of other things have the consequences of home working. I mean, clearly there are tax implications for people working abroad. So those people undertaking it on a casual basis that we've anecdotally heard about. Clearly, there are certain barriers to it happening. And although obviously work is ongoing on the effects of home working, not just the implications for office space, but obviously the issues around mental health as well. So there are myriad things that we do need to be monitoring as we go forward.
Yeah, we do. How has the Mayor engaged with businesses and organisations affected by the pandemic? And that's to you, Jules, obviously.
Well, this is one of those ones again. I need to say that I'd need to refer to a very complex, colourful PowerPoint slide with all the different tiers of engaged in recovery and the mechanisms that they've used to engage with communities, voluntary sector, civil society, and business. I mean, businesses are very heavily involved, and business representatives and their organisations are heavily involved in the work.
On the 5th of November, your colleague Rajesh Agarwal indicated to me in an Assembly plenary meeting that City Hall was only helping approximately 0.3 of London's businesses. Can you please assure me today that this number has improved over the past 6 weeks? And can you actually find out for me what the latest number is?
I'm happy to write to the committee on that.
Do you think it's improved since then?
The reason I pause and struggle with that is because I don't think it's necessarily that the 0.3 was necessarily a representative figure. That there are many different ways of engaging with businesses. Some of them harder to measure than others. So the supply of information, it's much harder to track who's accessed that and how widely it's disseminated. It's far harder to track that than simply, face-to-face interactions and the recording of face-to-face interactions. I don't know on what scale of interactions that 0.3, what that 0.3% was actually referring to.
Okay, it was figures that Rajesh was actually giving us at the time. I mean, Rajesh also told us in June that the Mayor's economic recovery strategy was on the top of our minds, and that's a quote, but it still hasn't been published, has it? Do you know when it will be?
Well, I presume that was a reference to sort of the recovery strategy that I referred to earlier that has been drawn up by the LEAP and published?
It has now been published. When was that published?
Probably about two weeks. Well, a LEAP was last week, so I think it was probably last week.
Okay, I will certainly read that with interest, if it's what we're referring to. The Mayor has also spoken out about the damaging impact of this pandemic on the West End and other central parts of London. And indeed, he recently said that the pandemic had created a potential existential threat to central London. Do you think his decision to relocate City Hall away from the centre of the city to Zone 3 is inconsistent with his apparent desire to support central London?
No, I mean, the Mayor has said that it would be the move would obviously be supportive of regeneration in the docks area. The Royal Docks obviously is a focus of London's regeneration. In the same way that locating City Hall, albeit next to a very fine, famous landmark in the form of Tower Bridge, it wasn't in a central London business district at the time. It has now become one around London Bridge, but at the time it was located there, it wasn't. So it's using it as a catalyst for regeneration rather than simply keeping it located in a central either political, civic or business zone.
You don't think that central London is crying out for a confidence boost at this moment? Because I would say it was. You're saying it's not. We absolutely need to be sort of rallying to the cause of London, both within London, both nationally and internationally. But I would hope that it would that rallying cry would be broader than simply about the location, the physical location of City Hall. Well, I think there are many of us that disagree, but I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chairman. You're on mute, Chairman.
I certainly am. Thank you very much for that, Susan, and some interesting points there about the impact of City Hall on confidence and on the central London experience. But I'm going to pass back to Assemblymember Caroline Russell now. Caroline's going to ask some questions, and we have been joined by Sam Gurney as well. So we have everyone that you need to be able to address your questions to is present on the call. And Jules, because you come back with us, we have got some more questions for you a bit later as well. So we'll come back to you as well. So thank you very much for coming back. Caroline.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm slightly slow about unmuting there. Yes, these questions are about the impact on Londoners of working remotely, and particularly the impact on employees. So to Sam Gurney and also to Jordan Cummins, what is the, and perhaps to Sam first, what is the impact of working remotely for Londoners? And how does remote working affect relationships amongst colleagues?
Thanks, Chair and Caroline. And I've been listening with great interest to the rest of the discussion this morning, because obviously from a TUC point of view, we've got a huge interest in all of the other issues you've been discussing, and I sit on the recovery board, so I've been involved in quite a lot of that work so far. Caroline, on your specific question, obviously there are kind of big implications for the increase in home working. We've long been supporters at the TUC of increased genuine flexibility, so enabling people to work at home. There are obviously kind of different categories of that. We've got occasional home workers, regular home workers, and permanent home workers, and there are different things which apply to all of those. We've obviously seen a kind of steady increase up to the pandemic in the number of people who've been working at least some of the time at home, but obviously that has massively escalated, and I think it's the GLA figures which show the capital's got the highest percentage of jobs which are potentially doable from home. So we've got about 50% plus of the workforce who could do some or all of their work from home. In terms of what that means, obviously you've got kind of, some very basic stuff around the conditions of people who are working at home. And as you say, it throws up issues. So it's not come back to the keeping in touch bit. There's staying safe. There are obviously health and safety implications for working at home, just as there are in any other workplace. And we're seeing kind of that, you know, as we've seen this increase in home working over the pandemic, there are issues around what employers need to do to make sure they are actually carrying out risk assessments for their staff, that people have got proper equipment, people have got proper connectivity at home. That feeds into recovery plan mission on digital access in London, that people know what's expected of them if they're working at home. So that whole issue around hours, I suspect you may have all been finding this as well, but certainly in terms of working hours, once you're working at home, speaking on a personal note, the hours I'm doing seem to have mushroomed because people think you are always available. So this kind of, you know, constantly being on back-to-back Zoom calls and others is vast. So that whole issue around what's expected, what your hours actually are, and then the point you just made there, sorry, about staying in touch around kind of how management lines work if you're a home worker. And that feeds into quite a lot of our concerns around the kind of equalities agenda and the potential implications, negative implications of some of that for staff not being kind of seen to be around, that you can then favour people. You get into a whole kind of series of issues around that, which are really important. And I say that's not at all to undermine the fact that, as I said, we think there are lots of positives potentially on home working, but there are negatives as well that we need to look at very carefully. And there's lots of guidance which unions have been putting out pre and during the pandemic to staff around what they should expect, and to management around how you negotiate that. And we've seen some good practice examples. We've seen some of the kind of high-tech companies who put in place structures who actually are creating time for their managers to genuinely manage home working, because it does take more time and it has different responsibilities. And we've seen some pretty poor examples as well. And if we've got time, I would quite like to come back to some of the kind of the equalities impacts of this that we're seeing.
We'll come on to that just in a moment. But first of all, perhaps if I could bring Jordan in at this point, and from the CBI perspective, you know, what have you seen as the impact of working remotely for employees, and how does that, you know, what have you seen in terms of relationships between colleagues as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a few things here. Some of it Sam has touched on, and we're delighted that our friends at the TUC have done some fantastic guidance, and we tried to stay close to them on that. It's fair to say that there is good and bad practice, and the CBI stands kind of ready to weed out the bad. There's probably three main ones and then two additional ones. So there's potentially a growing mental health crisis among some businesses, and the way in which you manage that remotely, if we carry on going that way, is also very tricky. The balance point that Sam mentioned about work-life balance and actually not really knowing when people are switching off, it's very difficult to do so. If you've switched off, you don't know what your team is doing. The impact of siloed working is also, especially for larger businesses, you know, the people.
I think Jordan seems to have frozen. He's become a Disney character.
This is. I mean, we're talking about remote working and the problems of remote working, and this has happened. This is Jordan. I don't know if you can hear us, but maybe you've completely frozen for us.
No, there we go.
Sorry.
Try again.
Sorry, all. I'm not sure where I got to. Work-life balance, I think.
Yes. And siloed working.
Siloed working, and then the creation of a two-tiered workforce is something that's come up quite a lot. So lots of people working from home, some people thinking that they like to go back into the office, and then a few members of the management team manage to see them in the office, and sometimes it's quite easy to create those two tiers. And then finally, the point that came up earlier around informal networks and having places for them to land. They are fantastic and very easy to do, and it's fantastically easy to set up a Zoom call. But then maintaining them is quite difficult, and we saw the fatigue on pub quizzes that I'm sure we all tried to join earlier in the year run out quite fast. So when you group all of those together, there's 4 or 5 pretty chunky things there for employees to have to manage. And we've seen a real mix of the ways in which they manage them. So sometimes businesses have had long existing strategies around working from home, checking in, and really, really rigid middle management practices where some of this falls down quite a lot of the time. But some businesses actually really genuinely have had no idea how to manage these all at once. And I think a lot of the times in businesses, you can do some things really, really well in kind of sections. So you try and tackle one well this year, and then next year you work on the next one. But actually, a lot of these have come at the same time. So there's been a bit of a mix in terms of how businesses have managed them. But I think from our experience, we've seen some pretty good practice, but there's probably still quite a way to go.
Yeah, thank you. Back to Sam, you mentioned equalities, and I was wondering if remote working has affected employees with disabilities and whether there's further thinking and support required in this area.
So, absolutely it has. I mean, obviously, there are a large number of disabled workers who were working at home pre the pandemic, and it has increased. Particularly given the additional vulnerability, and we've seen the kind of death rate for disabled people kind of rising substantially under COVID. So there are, again, some advantages to working at home, but there can be some real disadvantages. So again, one of the key things that we always stress is that the Equalities Act provisions on reasonable adjustment apply to people working at home just as much as they do to people working in any other kind of work location. So reasonable adjustments do need to be made by employers at home, and that obviously at the moment includes things like increased provision for support for people who are doing video and phone conferencing, so all sorts of issues around people having access to captioning and to other kind of resources they need to be able to take part in meetings like this effectively if they're working from home. There are issues which are now obviously coming through the system around how the furlough scheme has been applied. Employers who've been saying that they don't think the additional cost of adjustments to people at home are reasonable, and so they've been potentially putting more disabled workers on furlough than other workers, and so there could be implications for that, and that we may see that playing out in the tribunal system because people may be bringing disability discrimination claims around that, so very important there. But again, kind of, and this feeds into to all workers, but the point Jordan was making there around kind of points around isolation, that this is kind of concerns certainly from our disabled members network in the region that said more disabled members are being told they should be working at home from others, and that does increase sense of isolation sometimes, sense of not being in contact with colleagues, and mental health issues, I said, which applies to everyone. So kind of some very important issues there. Got some good blogs up on the TC website on this, and some clear guidance on that. But I think the other issue there, just to kind of touch on, is that there is far wider equalities issues as well, class, gender, as well as kind of disability. So in fact, I said that in London, over 50% of jobs we think can be done potentially at home, but obviously that leaves a lot of jobs which can't. And Michael touched on this before in one of his answers. There's a kind of real danger of a two-tier workforce, in the sense that even before pandemic, if you were a home worker, you were much more likely to be a white male in a managerial position. They were people who were able to work at home, who were choosing to work at home, and the danger that you have kind of white collar jobs, working at home, decent conditions, good setup, you can do that, and then another layer we get hollowed out. We see other decent jobs leaving the capital because people can go and do those in other places, and we get left then with a kind of one tier of kind of good, very well paid jobs at the top, and then your outsourced kind of insecure work in various sectors kind of left below, and we're very worried that we might see that kind of panning out as well, and that needs to be watched very closely. And again, issues around kind of Rowena made a really important point around quality affordable childcare, the danger that, I said, home working can be very good for supporting, if it's done properly, can be good for being able to support all workers with caring responsibilities, but it can also be used as kind of cover for people being told, oh, well, you work at home, then you can pick up your kids, then you can work in the evening, then you can do this. And that's a real danger if we don't have that quality childcare in London, which we are seeing, said, real threats to as well. So kind of, big issues around that. And again, in terms of kind of ethnicity, we had a big release yesterday kind of on this, and the triple whammy hitting black workers in the capital. But one of the interesting issues there is that black workers are far less likely to be working at home, and that's reflected as well, we think, in some of the higher disproportionate kind of impact of COVID on workers, that people are much more likely to be in jobs where they can't work at home, or be told by managers they're not allowed to work at home. And again, kind of issues there that came up in our Dying on the Job report around kind of differential treatment of people when they are asking to work at home. And so again, something which we'd be very interested in the GLA kind of looking at research on what's happening there in London.
You also you mentioned the issue of class, and I think there's if you're living in overcrowded conditions and you are trying to work from home and you've got children off school and whatever, then that's a much tougher situation than someone who's actually got a space where they can close the door and work at a desk.
It's absolutely vital, Chair, if I might. I mean, 73% of homeowners, homeowners are 73% more likely to work at home. That was pre the pandemic than renters. And as I said, we're finding, again and again, I'm sure you'll all have colleagues, who are in shared housing or who have families who just don't have space. Team members who are working on a kind of kitchen table rather than having a kind of desk, and it's huge implications there for people. As I said, not just people who can't work at home because their jobs can't be done at home, but people who potentially could, but just don't have the space or the facilities. And again, that comes back to what employers can provide, but it also comes back to a point that was made in the earlier discussion on housing prices in London, and the danger that we might see some of those jobs going outside of London. Because people will be going, right, well, if I can work at home, I can afford to rent something considerably bigger if I move out of London and still do my job in London. So that does have implications for the future of the workforce in London.
Yeah, thank you. So finally, you touched on mentioning best practice, but what best practice have you seen from organisations with regards to working remotely, both on productivity but also supporting employees' well-being? And are there any examples you can give us? And Jordan, I'll come to you with that one. You did touch on some examples, but if you want to come in on that afterwards as well.
So I don't have concrete examples to hand. I was actually trying to find some before this hearing. So we'd stress the point around where workplaces are unionised. Lots of unions have got kind of quite good agreements in place on this. So, for instance, Unison, our largest public sector union, has got some very good home working guidance, which talks around negotiating kind of agreements with local authorities. And so we know there are local authorities who've done that. I'd like to be able to kind of to give back to you an example from outside London. Bristol City Council have got an excellent home working policy, which was developed long before the pandemic, but which kind of involves kind of lots of this stuff. We anecdotally are hearing, as said, kind of on the tech side, so companies who we might not think are particularly good in some other aspects of their employee relations, but actually have been good on kind of this angle. So kind of some of the big firms like Google, etc., who are clearly making time for their managers to manage home working, and have actually kind of put that in, doing some of the things that Jordan said around proper guidance on saying, when you're having team meetings, make sure you build in time for actual kind of social interaction as well, the sort of stuff you do in the office if you were talking to your team, but you don't just stick to business. So there's kind of anecdotal evidence of kind of lots of that stuff being developed, but it was one of the things that we were going to highlight, which was in terms of the kind of GLA's research function, kind of some collecting of some of that information would be good, looking at how the good work standard could be evolved to kind of take some of this into account. I haven't gone back and looked at the Mayoral Good Work Standard just to see if some of this stuff is in there, and trying to gather perhaps some good examples from the companies who've signed up to that about what they're doing, because that will then champion the Good Work Standard, but also champion some of that good practice, which we are fairly certain is out there. But I said I'd like to be able to say company X, Y, and Z have done this, but I don't actually have that information to hand. Mm-hmm. Jordan might.
Yeah, Jordan, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. So I think similar to Sam, a lot of it's anecdotal, but from what we've seen from the people who have large inner city workforces, so professional services, consultants, legal firms in and around the city, one of the main things that I think that they've had good feedback from the workforce on is just the role of leadership, and not just at the top, in the middle. And the middle bit's really important, I'll come back to, but at the top, the role of leadership in saying, we know there's been this big exogenous shock to the workforce, we know you're anxious, we are going to do this definitely, regardless of what the restrictions say. And I think things like legal firms turning around and saying, we now expect 50% of all of our work in an industry that is very reliant on person-to-person paperwork type transaction work. We expect around 50% of the work to be remote, regardless of what happens in the tier, regardless of when we come out of the pandemic, regardless of how long the recovery takes, is just a role of leadership, I think. And at the top, setting out what we expect, I guess, of our employees and what we're going to do for them, regardless of what happens politically. And then at the middle management section, recognising that they are also leaders in terms of training provision. So one of the good things about the pandemic with people working from home is that, unfortunately, while it does fill up your diary, you can take on quite a lot of additional training, you can register things remotely, and while the person-to-person isn't quite as good, there is no kind of restriction on your ability to do that if you can fit it into the diary. And the quality of making some of this employee expectation stuff work at middle management level relies on more of a heavy band of training, I think, at that section. So the kind of recognition at top level that leadership, the organisation is going to do X, recognition at middle leadership, the organisation is going to do Y, I think combined have shown that there's been quite a good reaction from the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I mean, all of this just opens up the complexity of it for, small and micro businesses who are struggling with this remote working and but without those kind of bigger management structures in place that either help or hinder everyone to get on with their work. Chair, I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Yes, and I think Assembly members, we need to pick up the pace a bit because it's 12 and there are a few people who did indicate in advance that they would like to try and finish around about 12:30 because they've got other things that they need to go off and do, and I'm sure that might apply to some of our guests. So we're going to come on next to Assembly Member Susan Hall. Susan, over to you for the next batch of questions.
Thank you. Jordan, if I can start with you. Are employers equipped to adapt excuse me, to these new ways of working in the long run, do you think, and is additional support required from the government or the mayor? And is there any sense whether or not London's broadband coverage is great enough to support continued levels of working from home? We can certainly prove that at times it doesn't seem to be.
Thanks, Susan. I think the latter point has been answered by the fact that I dropped off for about 20 seconds earlier. I think on the broadband rollout point, it's something the CBI has been working quite closely with central government on for quite some time. I think not just rural, we underestimate the fact that in parts of the city of London, actually the density doesn't allow you to have megabyte speed that you need sometimes to even run a video call. So let's not take for granted the density impact. I think on the long-term adaptation, some of it will come down to cost. And I think, as Caroline said, if you're a small business, there are just natural limitations on what you can give your workforce. And I think just having an honest conversation with firms who just can't afford it in the short term is really, really important so that they don't feel chastised for not being able to do so. But where you do have resource, I think clarity is important. So what we've seen in some members is instead of saying there's maybe a budget here, it's a bit opaque, you can claim it if you do X, Y, and Z, you have more success with your workforce by saying there's a fixed budget, here is what you can claim, and here's the time frame in which you can claim it. So people, and most people, if they have to work from home, will probably max that out, but that's fine because then it's within a parameter. So I think just the clarity from businesses in terms of what they are giving their workforce and how quick they can give it to them is really, really important. But I do think over the long term, it's just going to depend on the balance sheet. And if we're looking at a really tough January, February, March, and more people have to work from home, if you're a small or medium-sized business, you just might not have the cash. And I think there could be some kind of exemption, and there might be more tax relief. And I know businesses can claim back quite a lot as it is, but perhaps there is more we could look at there.
Okay, fine, thank you. I mean, do you think this will have an impact on wages going forwards?
As an offset measure, if we kind of give people more stuff from home, we expect them to be paid less in that sense? Is that what you mean?
Well, do you think it'll have an impact and on productivity? I mean, when we started, people were quite enthused. And now I think very many people are very wary of what's going on now. And therefore, if productivity is hit, do you think that will trickle down into wages being hit by it as well?
It's a good question. I don't think it's impossible. I think there's a bit of a lead-in time for that kind of decision at a board level, I would say. I think if you're a board sitting there looking at productivity this year, you're going to recognise that even if it's spiked, there could be some volatile reasons for that, like we said earlier, with no work-life balance and people having to work all hours. I think people need a bit more time probably to assess what's really going on in the workforce. So I wouldn't say that we're going to be looking at a kind of mass reduction in wages because people suddenly have worked out that this is quite stressful to work from home. I think there's a bit of a longer lead-in time than that. But I don't know, Sam's probably got some more on-the-ground examples of where people have been a bit more acute in those conversations.
Yes, I'm coming to Sam next. I mean, the problem is for the very small businesses that if productivity slows down, they can't look too much to the future because of their cash flow. Thank you, Jordan. If I can ask the next question to Sam, does the Good Work Standard need to be updated in light of people now working extensively from home?
Oh, just checking I'm not on mute, sorry, I didn't put myself back on mute. I think it's well worth having another look at it, so I couldn't say whether it absolutely needs to be updated, but I certainly think it could be reviewed with a view to just looking at the provisions. As I remember, from when we were kind of looking at its development, there is kind of some good stuff in there. I think it's probably more the guidance that goes alongside it. So in terms of issues like access to training, access to support, workforce engagement, they're things where kind of looking at what businesses are doing on those things may now be slightly different if a larger percentage of people are going to be working at home kind of going forward. So I think it could definitely do with a team who are looking at that, having a look at the guidance that goes alongside it, with a view to just making sure that it's it's in line and looking at if there are any gaps that need to be looked at. Just in terms, Susan, if I could very quickly on your other questions, I mean, I think the point around employers being equipped to adapt is really important. On specifically, for instance, on things like disabled workers, obviously there's making sure that employers know that they can access the access to work kind of funding for provision for equipment at home and making reasonable adjustments. So there's things like making sure that's up on the business hub at the GLA, making sure that guidance is there. I think it is, but again, it would be worth kind of checking that. Your point on broadband is critical, and again, it does come under the digital access mission, because it's not just the issue around do we have kind of adequate coverage, it's also the issue around do people have the kit and do people have the knowledge and skills to be able to use it and work from home. And I know we've all kind of very quickly had to pick up on using Teams and Zoom, etc. But you can imagine if you're a worker who's been not used to working at home, if you've been retrained or redeployed to doing a job where you work at home and you've never had to deal with kind of digital skills, then that's going to be really important. And that comes under a number of bits of the kind of recovery missions, both skills academy stuff and the access to digital bit. On the wages, I think really interesting question. I mean, we're coming at it from a slightly different position. I mean, I think a lot of the evidence shows at the moment home workers' productivity is up. Now, there are obviously cost savings of having large numbers of your staff working at home. If people are long-term not going to be having to buy or rent kind of extra office accommodation, etc., then not paying as much on bills for energy if people are working at home using their own kind of broadband, etc. So there are issues there that we're negotiating where we've got recognition for actually making sure that workers who are working at home get recompensed for some of those expenses. There are tax implications. You can obviously claim back some issues for home working and stuff, but I think people are very unclear on what that is, and as that pans out over the coming months, we're going to need to look at that. But obviously everyone's very focused at the moment on immediate pandemic stuff. But as I said, we would expect we're coming out of this with a large number of people working at home, and there are going to be implications there for all different sizes of business. But I absolutely take the point that for smaller businesses and micro businesses, it's some different issues that they're facing.
We certainly are. Thank you, Sam. Thank you. My next question will be to Jules, please. How will remote working impact young people entering the job market? And what can the Mayor do to support young people newly entering the job market? Jules, are you on mute, Jules?
There you are.
That's it.
I think you've got a slow connection in, assuming you're in Hackney, it always seems to be a really slow connection.
Did you want the question again, Jules? Would that help?
I think it's his mute is going on and off. Try unmuting.
That's it. Just leave it there. You're there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you can now.
Yeah, there's still a line through my microphone. I was trying to unmute, but it's still showing me as muted. Sorry about that. Yes, sorry, Susan, I did hear the question. I mean, just picking up on what some of the other speakers have said. I mean, the sort of informal networks that the office activity provide. Removing those, it probably has the greatest impact on young people than for any employees. White collar apprenticeships, for example, I can't fathom how they can effectively work from a wholly sort of home-based work environment. So we have to factor that in if there was any significant move to home working. But I think what we've heard today is that it's very premature to make assumptions about a mass move to a permanent home-based environment. As for what the Mayor's doing, a lot of this is through the work he's doing is through the use of the adult education budget and the adaptations that we've made to the funding regime for that. We think it can play a critical role in supporting Londoners post of age 19 or up, both with those with few qualifications or those who are facing perhaps long-term unemployment. retraining, reskilling, upskilling to access new job opportunities. There are a number of changes we've made, both to enable colleges to better provide courses in the current environment, but also to increase the ease of access to young people, by young people.
Yeah, but what's the Mayor actually doing to encourage the GLA functional bodies to help support young people entering the job market, particularly during the pandemic, because we know those under 25 have been twice as likely to lose their jobs?
I could write to the committee as far as sort of MOPAC, TfL and the Met. I'm not aware of what they've been specifically doing. So rather than me try to second guess, it would probably be more useful for the committee if I wrote to you with that.
Okay, I mean, just to say, are you aware that the London Fire Brigade has effectively scrapped 2 apprenticeship schemes in their draft budget while creating 2 positions that cost over 100,000 each?
No, I'm sorry. With the breadth of my portfolio, I don't keep up to speed with that kind of detail with the fire brigade, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, you're now up to speed with that particular issue. I'll let a colleague ask the next question.
Yes, thank you very much, Susan. We're just going to move on shortly to Murad. I just wanted to actually, Jules, if I could just ask you a question, which is about whether the Mayor has any kind of view at all of whether or not we should have some sort of standard 4-day week, so that everybody moved on to a 4-day week. Is that something that would both potentially help with bringing young people into the job market, but also might help in terms of flexible and remote working? Obviously, some people could then be doing compressed hours, compressing into 4 days. I suspect some people are compressing into doing 60 hours at the moment. And there might be some implications there in terms of you could spread out people's days into different parts of the week. So that might help with office cost expenses. But it may not be something that has come up as a discussion point yet to address any or all of those issues.
Yeah, it's not something that's been discussed with me, but I think those kind of issues though that's all part and parcel of the discussion about productivity. I think there are huge question marks, as people have already raised, about how genuine is some of the boosts we have seen in productivity in certain sectors during COVID, which I think, as some of your speakers have said, has been by the result of people working astonishingly long hours. The back-to-back Zoom meetings, and if their jobs involve a lot of face-to-face interaction, or simply being at the other end of a computer, a laptop, from sort of 8 in the morning till 8 at night. Just simply sweating people for longer hours is not the same as increased productivity, as I'm sure the economy committee know.
Well, we've got Sam Gurney from the TUC here, so I think he'd be pretty angry if we didn't agree with that. And I can see Sean was nodding vigorously. And I think we all know people who've been personally, I know a couple of people working in HR who've actually been doing 10-hour days because there's been a lot of redundancies that they've been involved in assisting with. So yeah, it's pretty brutal for the people being made redundant. But if you're working those extended hours, it's not good for your health, physical or mental. Thanks for that, Jules. That was just an interjection from me. I'm actually going to bring in Assemblymember Murad Qureshi now, who's going to ask some further questions, and then we'll come back to Susan just for a final wrap-up, I think. Murad, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan, for making way on this question. I'm just going to ask a question about the adult education budgets. And I'll probably start with Jules before I go to Sam and Jordan. What are the Mayor's plans going forward for the adult education budget with regards to supporting these new ways of working that we've been discussing for the last 20 minutes?
The principal changes at the moment have been to do with to enable adult education across the board to actually happen. Because obviously we were faced with it completely grinding to a halt at the very time when it can be so valuable in helping people to retrain and find work, whether for the first time age 19 plus or whether I say older and facing redundancy. So obviously there's been a whole range of interventions with the sector to enable people to take advantage of that retraining. Probably sort of longer term though, to sort of perhaps I get the sense that your question was more about the sort of the specific courses, perhaps. Is that where?
I think we need.
I mean, we're looking at a particular sort of sector-based interventions for those areas in particular that will be, that are facing shortages, both in the creative and cultural industries, in social care, digital, and also green industries as well. So we'd be looking to encourage, as it relates to the AEB, we would be looking to encourage the FE sector to pivot towards those particular industrial sectors and social care.
Okay, well that's interesting. I myself am thinking of doing a coding course, but I'm not sure whether that's going to help me or not. Sam, what do you think needs to be done on the adult education programme to help people make these adjustments? Clearly, we're having to make both in employment and outside of employment.
Thanks, Murad. Well, it's one of the good things about having the devolved adult education budget in London is it does give us some freedom and autonomy to look at priorities. So some of the stuff had already been happening. So the fact that in London people can access courses for free if they're on or below the London living wage was really important, and it's going to be very important for workers. I don't use the term low skilled because most of those jobs are actually skilled, but are termed low skilled. But for low paid workers to be able to access that, particularly people who are going to be affected where there's closures. So continuing to use the adult education budget to do that is going to be very important. Making sure that through other sources of funding that we've got, so I sit on the LEAP, and the LEAP obviously has the kind of capital funding support for further education. So making sure our colleges have actually got the infrastructure to deliver these courses is important. And Jules just touched on it. I mean, my next meeting after this, funnily enough, is with colleagues in the skills team at City Hall to look at the skills academies that are being kind of considered, building on the model of the Mayor's Construction Academy. So it's not a physical kind of building, it's bringing together stuff in key sectors. And Jules outlined the kind of the initial areas that we're looking at there, which will be supporting green jobs, jobs in the digital sector, health and social care, and creative and leisure industries. Now, those are areas which are either much needed or are going to be hugely affected by the pandemic, and they're also often areas where there are quite considerable decent work deficits. So one of our key points is we need to use the education budget to make sure that we're skilling people up to fill vacancies or move into new jobs which need to be created kind of in London. But what we're not doing is skilling people up to send them into bad quality jobs. So it needs to run alongside the other work that City Hall unions and employers are doing on kind of quality jobs, and creating, as I said, those new jobs which are going to fill some of the gaps where we know there are going to be permanent changes in the labour market. And the adult education budget is going to be really important to helping people to reskill. And if I could, Chair, sorry, I know we're short of time, but we're just at the moment engaged in some very intensive discussions with the government on the Union Learning Fund, which is a small but very important budget, £12 million a year, which funds workplace learning. So employers and unions working together, 200,000 people go through those kind of basic programmes in the workplace every year. And the government announced with no notice a month ago that they were going to end that funding from April next year. We are in some discussions at the moment. We are hoping that we will be able to come up with new funding to meet that gap from central government. We know we've got lots of support from different bits of central government on that. So discussions with Bays and the Treasury at the moment on that. If that doesn't happen, then we will be, or we are already sort of talking to City Hall around where there may be potential to use bits of the adult education budget in London to specifically target workplace learning and make sure that gaps that are lost by losing the ULF can be filled. So again, because
I'm hoping our other
Leonie.
Thank you, Sam, for that.
Sorry, Mirad, I'm hoping our other guests are not going to also be putting in bids. The point is not for people to put in bids for what you would like it to be spent on. That was a very cheeky moment there from Sam Gurney of the TUC.
Yeah. I'd more stress the importance of workplace learning to some of these gaps. Of any source. Workplace learning of any source.
If you restrain yourselves, back to Murad.
Jordan now. Jordan, what does business want from the adult training programme? And do they have a role to play on making online training available? Undoubtedly, that will improve productivity at home as much as when people do come into the office.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think, to be honest, business has a huge role to play. And actually, earlier in the year, some of our large recruitment members took it on themselves to invest in an online training platform that they put out to their supply chain and clients for free. So it can be done. And I think that we're starting on a journey of, big businesses with the resource and kind of foresight, I guess, and ability to scan the horizon, being able to do these things and actually doing them, I think stepping up, which is fantastic and we've encouraged to see. I think the point Sam made on the adult education budget, of only 300 million, it's only going to spread so far. So there is still going to be quite a big role, I think, for central government to play in this. And some of the things that we've been talking about in the last few months are, we've called for the apprenticeship levy to be changed to a flexible skills levy for some time, using job centres to become training centres as well. These are hubs in communities where people should go and be trained as well as just signposted to existing jobs. And then some kind of flexibility around getting people to invest in their own learning. And I know that's difficult for some, but there's introductions of new flexible loan entitlements, so kind of working on how that works for individuals. And then the final point I would say is there's a lot of talk about retrofit at the moment and these big kind of green job opportunities that I guess we could have in London, and we're talking about tens of thousands of roles. But I think more attention needs to be paid into the transferable skills you would get from that job. So the GLA has put a lot of great work into this no wrong door approach, which is fantastic, but kind of articulating to the people who might want to step into these roles what they lead to eventually. Because at the moment it feels like we're just talking about this kind of wartime effort to get these retrofit jobs up and running, but where are they going to go afterwards? And I think that's what we're kind of focusing a bit more on.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Jordan. And I'm sure we'll need to, a lot of people don't have the gear as well. I think you'll be surprised to know that there are people, a fair amount of the population doesn't actually have access to computers at home. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. Can I just end this area of questioning back to Jules? The Mayor allocated £6 million from Skills for London as part of the COVID response fund. It was launched in May. Has that been successful in your mind? And what can we expect in the future?
Which fund was that? Because there's been numerous funds. I mean, there's the COVID-19 response fund.
This is, I've been told, this is a £6 million fund allocated to Skills for London COVID-19 response fund.
Yeah.
Oh right, that's actually 11. That's £11 million.
Okay. 11.
And that's been provided to AEB providers, further education colleges and other independent providers, specifically to expand their online provision, because obviously many colleges were set up to do face-to-face interaction in rooms in their buildings. So we acted quickly to enable them to both gear up their tutors to be able to do online supervision and online delivery of seminars and so on, as well as make sure that both they and their learners were equipped. Those that you've rightly said, risk of digital exclusion. Often the figures that quote people who have access, the numbers of people who have access to being online at home. Often that refers to smartphones, and that's really inadequate for a child, whether it's a child at school to do their homework or someone attending a further education college, to expect to use their mum or dad's a smartphone to be able to, whether it's essays or research the internet or whatever. So that was the core use of the 11 million. But there's been a variety of other interventions. Fully funding level 3 qualifications. They're equivalent to A level. Any courses that are level 3 that last a year or less. So for any Londoner who's unemployed or at risk of unemployment, can take advantage of that. You heard from Sam mention the funding up to London living wage level people to take advantage of courses, increasing the rate as well of courses to attract and retain good staff within colleges. And also, I think probably one of the most crucial things we've done is introduce the 10% flexibility in budgets that AEB providers hold. So rather than quite a tight prescription on what courses it can be used for, we've loosened that for 10% of their budget, and it's really been strongly welcomed by colleges to enable them to do these short, sharp interactions that can perhaps get people back into work quickly. So that can range from sort of very basic job readiness interventions, or perhaps something digital, something that's sort of a small thing that perhaps someone lacks on an otherwise sufficient CV that could get them to get them into work, and it's allowing colleges to adapt and be nimble and take action on that, which previously they haven't. They've been quite hidebound on national rules as to how they can use the money. They still have to account for it at the end of the day, but whilst during being in flight and the kind of of the year of delivery, they're able to be more nimble and intervene as they need to.
Okay, well, I can see this area growing as an issue of concern and a way of dealing with the new world upon us. Can I hand back to Susan Hall as finishing the questioning in this area?
Thank you very much. I can bring in Rowena, if I may, at this point, and concentrate on the smaller businesses. Rowena, what more could the Mayor do to support employers and employees to manage the transition to remote working?
Well, we've just been talking about skills and training there, and I think for small businesses, digital skills is of key importance. I think upskilling existing employees, but also there was a mention earlier about Jordan was talking about leadership roles, both at senior management and middle management. I think as small businesses move beyond resilience and into recovery, and they are trying to grow, I think that becomes of prime importance in terms of setting up a business at the very beginning that is going to thrive, that is going to treat its employees well, that is well organised and have the resources necessary to thrive. But specifically in the digital skills regard, I do think that many small businesses are not as well equipped as you might think. Even levels of basic training would be welcomed. And then obviously building upon that further specialist knowledge and needs that are there. But yeah, skills and training, I think, is definitely really important to that.
Okay, thank you. Now, Jules, just a couple of quick ones for you and then I'm finished. Lockdown has given many people a greater appreciation for space, and continued working from home arrangements have meant that many want more space to do their jobs effectively. Do you think the Mayor's propensity to focus his housing strategies on very small units could potentially lead to even more Londoners choosing to leave the city because they can't get the space they need?
I think the London plan does the opposite. It actually encourages space standards that we often don't see outside of London. I mean, the question of bedroom numbers is something different. The London plan doesn't specify additional bedrooms and would never specify additional bedrooms for use as office space. What it seeks to do is achieve sufficient space for our day-to-day activities in the other habitable rooms, and if the London plan guidance is followed, what we build today would have a greater propensity to be able to be used for a degree of home working.
Well, the Assembly itself has called on the Mayor to review all his housing policies and strategies in light of the link between COVID-19 mortality and overcrowded living conditions. So do you know if the Mayor is intending to undertake this review? If so, would you not agree it could potentially be advantageous to addressing some of the challenges of working from home?
Sorry, the line crackled there a bit, but I think I got the gist of it. I mean, yes, I mean, the Mayor will always keep all the policies under review. I'll check with the Deputy Mayor for Housing that it's specifically, that if there's anything specifically being undertaken. But obviously, you know, the Mayor would always be prepared to alter policies if it was going to achieve a better outcome. But in terms of kind of size of units, as I say, the size of homes prescribed in the London plan, as I say, there are specific size requirements on on overall size of homes, and in the social sector, it does allow boroughs to set specific bedroom mix requirements as well in the social sector.
Okay, well, I will have to agree to differ on that one, Jules, but thank you anyway. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Susan. And Assembly Member Hall has just brought our questions to an end. So I want to thank our expert guests who've joined us today. Rowena Howie from the Federation of Small Businesses, Jordan Cummings from the CBI, Michael Cracknell from Deloitte, we've had Sam Gurney from the TUC, Laura Davison from the City of London, and they're no longer on screen, but Jules Pike and his two colleagues, Michele Pertini and also Patrick Dubeck. Thank you. I can see Caroline is actually clapping. Thank you very much. We've had a very high quality set of answers from the guests today, and it's been very useful for our deliberations in our series of meetings where we've been looking at the impact of COVID on businesses, on workers, on the high street, on the lead up to Christmas. And we did that meeting before we even knew that Tier 3 was going to happen, and that's been really helpful. We know we've asked you to look into your crystal balls in one sense and try and figure out use of retail, commercial and office space going into the future and how we'll all be working. But thank you for working with us on that. So finally, Assembly members, can I ask you to note the report that was previously circulated in the discussion that we've just had, and if you're minded, can you delegate authority to me as the chair in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any appropriate outputs from this meeting? Is that agreed?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you. Item 6 is our Economy Committee work programme, which is found on pages 53 to 56 of your agenda. Could I ask the committee to note the work programme as agreed by the chair of the GLA Oversight Committee and also under delegated authority on the 3rd of December 2020? Is that noted? Thank you. And just to let you know that one of the things that was agreed was the date of our next meeting, which I'm pleased to inform you is on the 20th of January 2021 and will be at 10 a.m. and I would imagine will be in this virtual format. There is no business that I consider to be urgent, and if I had the gavel, I would bang it. But funnily enough, I don't have a gavel at my house, so I'm going to virtually bang the gavel and say that this meeting is closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
GLA Chamber Sound.